Hello everybody, this is BUS414 Globalization and Business at Cold City University again. My name is Roland, and in today's session we are going to talk about a brief history of imperialism. And I have chosen to name it this way because first of all we looked in last session that trade and globalization are not new phenomena. And in the past this has always been associated with some form of exercising power, a great power exercising power over a small nation. For example, the European powers over their colonial possessions in Africa, South America and Asia. So we are going to look at the ugly side of trade today, and we are looking how organizing trade has moved from coercion to a collaboration. We are going to look at the corporate empires of the Middle Ages, even later to the more modern times, and look at the Bretton Woods Agreement in the aftermath of World War II. Let's get started with the really ugly truth of trade. When we are looking at trade, then what we mean is an exchange of goods. But that exchange is not necessarily voluntary, as this picture can show you. And it doesn't mean that the exchange of goods is actually beneficial for all participants in this equation. And with goods, we really mean anything. It could be immaterial goods, it could be items like land, for example. It could be the occupation of territory and exchange of people. So what has happened in a lot of European wars, they were fought for resources and certain strategically important areas. So when we come across trade and the problems with it, there's always moral and ethical questions, and one of the biggest trades in history was the slave trade, obviously. So slave trade happened in an early form of supply chain management, so to speak. So what happened was that European nations took very cheap goods to Africa, bought and caught slaves there, which means the local population, brought them to America for work on the plantations in the southern United States, for example, but even more so in the Caribbean, and took the goods produced there by these slaves back to Europe, and the trade started all over again. Now, when we look at this, these slaves were captured, they were first forced to work, and we would initially assume that the business value is very high because you don't pay for that labor, right? Obviously, the morality of this kind of transactions is very low. We know that today, and people knew that already in those times. Then why did it happen, and why do we feel this is, or do we say that the business value was high for everybody involved, except for those poor people that were traded as possessions? When we look at the development of societies, then what we see is the more enlightened societies become, the more they will refrain from any form of coercion, and up to the point where these enlightened societies themselves become the target of coercion or coercion attempts from other powers. So we have developed legal frameworks, religious and philosophical views that say you should not do certain kinds of things, and developed more a sense of understanding that we are all human beings, no matter our what we look like, our skin color, our religion, and any other determining features. Now, one of the facts that retrospectively we can say that no, slavery was not a good business also for the business owners. So for example, if you owned a ship that was engaged in this trade, or if you were a sailor engaged in this kind of trade, it was obviously a very dangerous business to sail across the Atlantic in those times. So you have this kind of risk in a sense of the value of the business might decline and stand in no proportion to the problems you are facing. Then what initially started as an idea of, well, if we use slaves, that labor is free, moved onward to, well, these slaves are not very productive. We need to encourage them with violence to be more productive, and they don't stay on that field or in that place that we assign to them. They are understandably trying to run away. So we need to invest money into not only further coercion or in violence. We need to arrange a system of supervision that does not only cover our plantation, our farm, but cooperate with other business owner, plantation owners that are using a similar or the same system to catch slaves that escaped and bring them back. So what happened in the end was obviously that in the American Civil War, one of the reasons why the Civil War was fought was over economic concerns by the southern slave states. When a man like Abraham Lincoln came into power, was standing for election and came into power, who said that slavery would be abolished at some point. So obviously there is a little bit more about any kind of business transaction, and the immediate gain from any kind of business venture can very easily turn into its exact opposite. So in summary, we can say no, slavery was not a good business for anybody involved. For the slaves, naturally, for the plantation owners, they lost everything ultimately, and also not for those engaged in that trade, trading goods back and forth, and human beings as well, because they were facing a lot of dangers as well, and ultimately lost their ability to do this kind of business, because when slavery is outlawed and that is your business model, you don't have a business anymore. So what is coming out in more modern times again, unfortunately, is that there is, in a globalized society, there's always the problem of the weakest link. So when we have, for example, to stay with this example, a global agreement to abolish slavery and to follow certain rules concerning any form of employment, and you get one nation on this planet that violates this agreement and gets away with it, so it becomes problematic when this contestant in the market, when this player, when this power can actually enforce their will and defend their decisions with violence. And if there is one constant in human history, then that is the use of violence in order to get what you want. So when we are talking about using violence as means to enforce your will upon others, the first part of trade organization is actually born out of that. It is when individuals and corporations were organizing trade on behalf of nations, but essentially with their own risk and their own revenue system in place. Now, a lot of the people will know these flags. They stand for the Hudson's Bay Company and the British East India Company, which started doing business or trade in the 1600s. But it was as early as the 1400s where the Portuguese, in this case Fernão, Gomes, were enabled with state-controlled monopolies and had the authority of states in the areas which they controlled. So a big part of Africa was actually explored and later colonized in this fashion. The other country that was explored in this fashion, also turned into a colony later on by the British, but the exploration and exploitation of Canada was done by French companies and by, in this case, French people on behalf, ironically, of the British king. So, starting with Fernão Gomes, he received a contract from Alfonso V of Portugal, who granted Fernão a monopoly in all kinds of trade in a certain area of Africa, for which he had to pay the privilege of $600,000 of today's money, and had to explore or develop a map of the Gulf of Guinea and the African coasts. And all was done in the name of the Portuguese sovereign. And when you go back in history, at these times the Portuguese and the Spanish were the actual global powers of colonialism and early imperialism. So in this picture, in modern day Ghana, you can see Elmina Castle, which was built by the Portuguese to defend their possession or their privilege in that area. Now, by royal charter, the Hudson's Bay Company was founded in 1670 by two Frenchmen. And ironically, as I said, Prince Rupert of England was their patron, their sponsor. And what happened is they were granted a huge area of land where no sort of infrastructure existed in order to develop a trade system or a trade station, a system of trade stations that bought fur from the locals and from other adventurers for fixed prices and exported those furs back to Europe. So what happened is that this charter gave those two Frenchmen a very wide range of authority and opportunity, which ended up with owning or being responsible for the larger part of Canada and part of the United States, and established a company as the local authority, the local ruler, the local head of state, king, whatever you want to call it. And this is probably the first example of a corporate nation state that we can think of. A similar feature with the British East India Company, founded even earlier in the 1600s, and at the height of its power it accounted for about half of the global trade. So when this organization took over a large swath of land in India and other areas of Asia, they had complete administrative power, including war powers. The East India Company had its own army, which at times was larger than the British army. So why was this so lucrative for both organizations as well as the early nation states? Well, for example, just like in the modern day, the nation state does not necessarily have the means, the interest, and the power to develop an interest in a certain area further. For example, in India. So, and it would be highly unpopular for any British government if they sent the British army to India to fight, even if they won. There's always a lot of people that don't come back from wars. And how are you going to sell that to your country? When you, on the other hand, send a private organization and give that private organization the power or the protection to say we are exercising absolute power in this area, including the powers to wage war. And then you are dealing with a system of mercenaries, and in essence the British East India Company was a mercenary organization as well as a trade organization, and it is a whole different game when you are saying, well, these people are contractors, they are on a contract, you will be a soldier for this company for X amount of time, and well, if you die, then that's too bad for you. But well, the politicians or the government of a certain nation, they don't get into all kinds of issues when other people die in this war. They don't have to justify themselves and say, well, our soldiers got sent to this country and now a lot of people are dead. Well, no, this is an organizational problem at this point. So a very similar consideration nowadays when you are talking about private military contractors, where a lot of in a lot of African nations these people are being recruited and used as mercenaries. So we are not reinventing the wheel. These business models, these actions are centuries old, and the game of power around the globe hasn't really changed. So I want to go back even further and introduce the organization of the Knights Templar. That was at one point the most powerful, not only clerical organization in human history. It was the most powerful organization in the world at its high point of the power, and it one of the features that really sets the Knights Templar apart from every other mercenary organization. First of all, they were only bound to their order by an oath, by a holy oath, and by proxy then to the Pope. So which is a spiritual leader, not a worldly leader. But what the Knights Templar are less famous for is they are the organizers of an early banking system from the 1150s onwards. And the way this banking system worked is that the Knights Templar had bases all over the Italy, the Middle East, and on those routes that pilgrims used to travel from Europe to the Holy Land and pray in Jerusalem. So what happened is that many times these people were attacked, were ambushed on their travel, and had their valuables stolen. So what happened is that those people went to the local or the nearby Knights Templar organization, Knights Templar base, and says, well, here are my valuables, they are worth this and that amount of money, and I want to have a credit for this. So what happened is that they got a credit slip, and that credit slip was also sent to another organization, another base in another country, so that person could show up at that local base and say, well, here I am, I want the equivalent of value. So what happened is that this organization became immensely rich and powerful, and one of the reasons for their downfall was that the French king Philip IV owed the Templars a lot of money, and he couldn't pay it back. So what Philip IV said is he went to the Pope and said, look, these knights that you have, they are actually heretics. So what are you going to do about it? And the Pope actually imprisoned the Templars and abolished the order. So Philip IV didn't have to pay back his debt to the Knights Templar. So when we look at the history of corporate empires, we can fairly say that these empires declined due to corruption or at some point competing with nation states that were not very friendly to them. The Knights Templar, for example, were absorbed by the French treasury, who then took over all their money. A lot of knights were killed, and a lot of knights in the lower ranks were absorbed by other hospitaller orders. For example, the Malteser Order of Malta, the Order of Cyprus, and the Hospitaller Order. So when these corporate empires neared the end, the nation states had become the de facto global powers. For example, the French Empire, the British Empire, and they took over the possessions of their middlemen, you could say. In case of France, they took over Canada until they lost it to the British. And the British Raj, which is a large part of India and Pakistan, was taken over by the British Empire. So when this happened, when this transition came from private enterprise to a nation state, we can also say that the nation state took now interest into globalized trade empires and using it as a source of increasing living standards for their own population. The problem is then when you have nation states developing this kind of interest in trade and owning pieces of land that they have no God-given right to, you start to bring nation states in confrontation with each other instead of organizations that can fight each other with economic terms. You have now nation states fighting each other with non-economic terms, which means that they are going to war with each other. And this ultimately led to one of the largest conflicts that human history has seen, that is World War II. So, and when the aftermath of World War II didn't really solve the underlying problems that had been created in this age of imperialism, another world war was fought, the greatest conflict in human history, and let's hope it stays that way. People saw that a radical reform of how we are organizing trade and interest in welfare needs to be organized. And that ultimately then led to the Bretton Woods Agreement that we are going to talk about in a moment. What really happened in the aftermath of World War II is there was nothing in Europe. Europe had been from France to Russia, everything had been destroyed. And there was only one winner in this conflict. When you look at the winners of World War II, the Soviet Union had its major economic areas completely destroyed, which is in Western Russia, Ukraine, and Belarusia. A lot of industries were only becoming productive in the Soviet Union again in 1944, when they were rebuilt from being transported away from the Germans. When the Germans invaded, the Soviet Union started to disassemble everything that is of value and send it back behind the Ural Mountains where they couldn't be reached. So another country that had enormous problems after World War II was, of course, the British Empire, which disintegrated basically with peaceful agreements or not so peaceful agreements. Almost all former possessions of all former colonies declared independence by the 1960s. And the war in Europe has led to a massive debt for the British Empire and its reliance on the United States to rebuild Europe. France was completely destroyed, first of all when the Germans invaded in the 1940s, and then when the Germans retreated in 1944 and 45. Germany was from north to south, from west to east, completely in ruins. Within 3 years, the Allies had literally bombed any building taller than 2 stories into rubble. And a very similar feat had befallen Japan, but in basically 6 months between the end of 1944 and 1945, the American Air Force completely obliterated Japanese cities and caused destruction unimaginable even when we see the pictures today. So basically the world was destroyed all over, and in order to avoid major conflict between nations, the idea was to rebuild the European economy with money and goods basically from the United States that had literally not been touched by the war, with the exception of a few attacks on its own soil. The Americans basically lived like in peacetime, never went to the form of mobilization that the Germans started to implement 1943 onwards. It was also a good fortune that the Americans had a lot of gold and were able to exercise their military and financial power to say, well, this is how we're going to do it, and used the US dollar as a dominating world currency in the time since World War II, and it still is, despite many challenges to the power of the US dollar. And I want you to look at these pictures. The 2 pictures on the left-hand side are, on the top, Japan, and at the bottom, Cologne in Germany. And just look at the absolutely comprehensive destruction that had been exercised in just a few years' time. And in equally a few years' time, the larger picture on the right-hand side, how it had been rebuilt. And by the mid-1950s, late 1950s, Germany was one of the largest economies yet again, and was leading the rebuilding of Europe with German goods as well as American assistance. And what was so important in this post-World War II European period of history was that the European nations at this moment were weak and had their complete infrastructure destroyed. So it was very helpful that the American soldiers stayed in Europe this time and not retreated like after World War II, and focusing on rebuilding the strongest economy, which was the German and the French economy. The Americans gave Europeans the reassurance and obviously also the money and the goods to pull themselves out of the destruction that had been caused. And a strong motivation for the Americans was, well, we don't want to fight a European war every 20 years. We need to go back to World War I and learn a lesson about, if we destroy economic means of a country, then that country will be motivated to use its means for evil purposes. And indeed has this assistance by the US through the Marshall Plan driven Europeans to closer cooperation with each other, and particularly the French and the Germans have, after World War II, taken great strides to have a better relationship with each other. And when the two leading economies of a continent are not going to war with each other, then a lot of problems are not going to appear. Now, how did Bretton Woods in practice works? Bretton Woods was based on the US dollars that the Americans put into the system, with a fixed exchange rate that was only allowed to fluctuate by 1% up and down. So in practice, what happened is that there was a fixed exchange rate between dollar and another currency. And if you wanted to change, for example, Deutschmarks into French francs, you had to go via a cross rate using the respective exchange rates with the US dollar. This is how exchange rates have been calculated. And what happened in practice in international trade is that all settlement of trade was done via the US dollar as a proxy medium, which obviously then benefited the Americans and the US dollar as a currency. And the US dollar was chosen partly because it was one of the very few currencies at that time what was still tied in a fixed exchange rate to gold. So for anybody buying US dollars, it was as good as buying gold in a certain quantity. So we can also say that if the French and the Germans want to trade with each other, they are basically trading in gold. And gold is something that will not lose value, unlike fiat currencies. So the backbone of a stable and predictable transaction was in this case the gold via the medium of US dollar. So we can see that certainty is one of the cornerstones of successful business. If you can predict what is going to happen within the time horizon of any kind of transaction, then this transaction becomes essentially risk-free or with very, very limited risk. So you can plan the future. What it also does is it does not allow for major distortions between participating economies, for example, the French and the German economy. So when we contain major or avoid major fault lines, we are actually reducing the potential for major unfavorable developments that can develop into armed conflict. What certainly helped was that international factor mobility and international capital mobility was extremely limited. You couldn't just go on a plane like today and fly to the other end of the world. You couldn't just send money all around the globe and invest in stocks in another country. That is essentially not possible for normal people like you and me. Now, another thing that really helped was the American interest of we don't want to fight wars for you guys. And coming out as really the only winner of World War II, the Americans were enormously dominant in terms of economy, finance, as well as obviously military. At the time when the Marshall Plan was implemented, the US was still the only nuclear power in the world. And if you have the most powerful weapons and military at your disposal to enforce your will, then what you say goes. So you need the power to back your system up. However, not all that is golden is actually golden. And in order to maintain this system, it started to cost a real lot of money. And at the same time, there was no flexibility or very limited flexibility to actually do something new. In essence, what happened is that a system that was set up for low factor mobility and regulated, very predictable flows of limited trade, mainly in one direction, was incapable of adapting to a more multilateral trade relationship. Now, what happens when the system becomes too small for the amount of traffic that you are building on? You need to put more and more money into it to actually maintain it. And in this case, it was central banks that had to put a lot of money into currency transactions, buying and selling US dollars in essence. So what happened is that this plus minus 1% exchange rate became more and more volatile and not really an equilibrium anymore or an agreement, because you had to constantly intervene in the market with buying and selling. Now that especially if the economic foundations are different, for example, between France and Germany, there is still a lot of difference in productivity and industrialization. It leads to depletion of foreign reserves and your gold reserves. That is what happens in the end. And obviously that is creating a new fault line that you want to avoid. So what happened? In 1973, basically the Bretton Woods system completely collapsed. Officially terminated, it was only in 1976, 1 year after the fall of Saigon. And you can see my little hint here is from 1968, very strangely coinciding with the American realization they can't win the Vietnam War, and had overburdened themselves with debt. Basically, the United States has been bankrupt ever since the Vietnam War. The world economy just hasn't realized it yet. We created more floating exchange rate. We allowed for larger fluctuations in the currency exchange markets. But even with the advent of 1970, only 22% of transactions were able to be covered in gold if need be. Now, with the 1970s and the abolishment finally of 1976 of the Bretton Woods system, we can also see that this kind of business empire declined by introducing larger margins or the removal of gold convertibility. So up until 1971, you could go to the American Central Bank and say, I have here X amount of dollars, I want gold. And that system worked very well. It is called a gold standard system. And one of the other countries that had a gold standard system before World War I was the German Reich, the German Empire. And you could bring 1,000 Deutschmark to the German Central Bank and say, well, German Reichsmark, sorry, at this moment it was the Reichsmark, not the Deutschmark. You could bring 1,000 Reichsmark to the Imperial Central Bank and say, I want gold, and you got gold. So when a system loses its foundation, then you see the leadership position of the country that has initiated the system to decline. And the American leadership in global economy has been challenged by First of all, Germany after the war, and then Japan in the 1960s, 1970s. So when trade between other nations increased, this was not reflected in the system of Bretton Woods and the supreme position of the United States dollar as the medium of exchange. So what happened was that through financing the Vietnam War and through expensive social programs, the US dollar was further devalued, while at the same time other currency like the German Deutschmark, now the euro, and the Japanese yen became more powerful, more important and valuable to the world economy. So this is the end of this session, and essentially my reflection on global trade and the use of force to enforce trade privilege. It has always been a part of human history that one group of humans uses force against another group of humans in order to better their own situation at the expense of another group. Now, whether we are looking at ancient times when the Greeks and the Persians fought, or when we look at modern times when the world seems to be more and more volatile and unstable, this has always been a situation of increasing volatility. We have gone through periods of peace and stability, but peace and stability for one group of humans has often led to horrible situations for other groups of human beings. And what we have seen that there is no such thing as a constant ruling apparatus that can govern large portions of the globe without falling victim to its own power and size. So when we look at the global situation right now, is that we can say, and we are going to look at the rise and fall of Western and European and Western powers in general, and how perhaps the current situation is leading to a rediscovery of the reasons why Western powers have been able to enforce their will on the whole world and hopefully come up with a solution for the future that does not rely solely on force and coercion, but chooses the way of cooperation to create win-win situations for all human beings. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.